The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. This week, we are wrapping up our campaign to raise funds for medical aid to Cuba. And I want to encourage those of you who have not yet donated to do so. Our donations go through the Global Partners for Health, which has just sent 6 million syringes to Cuba to help them in the vaccination of the Cuban people in using these vaccines that Cuba itself has developed. We've raised over $2,000 so far, and now we're wrapping up that campaign this week and pushing for 3,000. So please donate. Go to our website, globaljusticecenter.org, and click on the donation page that you will find there. Well, today our topic is the U.S. dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki 76 years ago. Gar Alperovitz will look at the geopolitical implications of that fateful decision. Was it the opening shot in the Cold War designed to send a message to the Soviet Union? It established U.S. dominance in the Pacific and put the U.S. in a powerful position to shape post-war Europe. A nuclear arms race was soon to follow as tensions grew between the two former allies. Some have argued that the existence of nuclear weapons and the fear of nuclear annihilation helped to prevent military conflict between the U.S. and Russia during the Cold War. But smaller proxy wars killed millions in the global South and wasted trillions of dollars of resources, leaving us all less secure. In recent years, the public has become aware of the existential threat climate change presents for humanity. But how about the threat of nuclear winter that would surely come from a nuclear war? Billions of people will either be annihilated instantly or face slow starvation as agriculture collapses. Today, humanity urgently needs nuclear disarmament. Yet most of the treaties that have limited nuclear weapons have been cast aside by President Trump, and the Biden administration is increasing our nuclear arsenal, threatening a new arms race. With a new Cold War developing with China and maybe Russia, the importance of treaties limiting nuclear weapons becomes clearer. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has now set their doomsday clock at 100 seconds before midnight. The need for citizen action is urgent, as we will hear from Gar. But before presenting him to you, I want to add that in addition to his role in exposing the mythology around the use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Gar was also a covert collaborator with Daniel Ellsberg in releasing the Pentagon Papers. And hopefully he will tell us something about that today, because it was something that, of course, was clandestine at the time. But just a few years ago, he went public about that role. Many others have still maintained their anonymity, though it was actually a team of people who assisted Ellsberg in that. So let me present to you then Gar Alperovitz, distinguished historian, political economist, activist, writer, and former government official. Take it away, Gar.
Okay, thanks, Cliff. There is something in the, I believe, online about the Pentagon Papers today that just came across my desk, kind of recalling all of that. There was a big story in the New Yorker at one point, which is being reprinted online, so you can find it there. We're going back to the implications of the first use of nuclear weapons, and let me try to set the scene and what that decision to use the atomic bomb did, and in that larger regard. The first thing to know is that the United States had cracked the Japanese codes. We were reading all of their diplomatic correspondence back and forth. And it was at that time they were attempting desperately, we had already defeated Germany, they're attempting desperately, and we knew this, to end the war through negotiations mediated by the Soviet Union. And that was the context that we knew the war was over. We knew they were trying to get out. There was no question about that. So most people don't know that. They're not aware that the decision makers understood that the Japanese knew the war was over. There was a discussion within the US government about the use of the atomic bomb, a very secret discussion, high level use. And there were questions that had to do not so much with Japan, but post-war Europe, and particularly the Soviet Union and the settlement of the European discussions. And President Truman at that time, and we have his diaries, saw the use of the atomic bomb not so much as ending the Japanese war. There was not going to be an invasion. We knew that at that time. He saw it as having, the language he used, a hammer on those boys. What does that mean? Those boys were the Russians. And so the decision-making was at the time of the first meeting between Truman and Stalin at the Potsdam Conference in 1945, which literally took place the day after the first successful nuclear test in the Alamogordo Desert. And it was time for that. They kept postponing the meeting with Stalin until they could test the nuclear weapons. And they did on the 16th of July, the first test occurred, and the first meeting began on July 17th with the Soviet Union on the settlement of the post-war world in 1945. So there's an intimate relationship right from the beginning of the Truman administration, not so much the Roosevelt administration before that, of how you could use the atomic bomb and that will give me a weapon against those guys, meaning the Russians, Truman's language. And so they always saw it as a tough guy kind of position. There were people, Oppenheimer being one of them, who got a meeting with Truman and urged not to do this because it would lead to an arms race of overwhelming proportions. But he lost the battle, and so did others lose the battle. And we now have thousands of nuclear weapons around the world. Whether that could have been cut short by an early attempt, either then or in the 1946-47 period, to negotiate a stable position so that neither side began building up, that option was lost to history by the hardliners in the Truman administration. But the first test of that was the use of the atomic bomb. We knew at that time, or American intelligence knew at that time, that that what was going on was that the Japanese were desperately trying to surrender and that the war was essentially over. So the bomb was not needed in that respect to end the war, according to US intelligence. It was all at this time within the White House, a lot of it was about, we can show this new weapon that will settle the problems in Eastern Europe with the Russians, that will give us a hand in Manchuria, they will back off. That kind of conversation was going on in the White House. This has been pretty well illuminated by historians in the modern period, but most people don't see it most Americans don't know that, although the historians have illuminated this pretty well. The result was an arms race of overwhelming proportions, which we're still living with. And so that history is really worth returning to and beginning to rethink the next period of arms control, disarmament, where we're now living with weapons that can literally, through climate change and literally close down a good part of world agriculture if we have major destruction and major blow up and the resulting effects on the climate. So that is the beginning of it. If you look at the details of it, Truman met with Stalin in 1945 at the Potsdam Conference in Germany to settle issues in Europe and to prepare for the possible war in the Far East. The Russians were scheduled. Here's the way to think about it. The Russians were scheduled to enter the war in the Far East at our request to join the war and help us. They were scheduled to do it 3 months after the German surrender. The German surrender occurred on May 8th, 1945. That would have made it August 8th would be the date of the Soviet Union Red Army was going to come in to shock the Japanese into surrender. And it was believed within US intelligence that that shock would end the war because the Japanese would realize they could not face both the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, the Red Army coming in. So our intelligence thought that the shock of that attack, which is why we requested the Russians to come in, would end the war long before an invasion. So there wasn't going to be an invasion by that time, according to American intelligence. But instead, knowing that, the Truman administration bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in order to prevent the Russians from participating in the ending of the war, but at the cost of 100,000 lives in roughly in each case, and the demonstration and literally the start of the nuclear arms race. The alternative position was to end the war with the shock of the Russian attack, and also to move quickly to work out an arrangement with the Russians so that we would not end up with a vast global arms race. That was the position taken by the Secretary of War in the United States. Most people don't realize this, but the historiography is very good on this. The very conservative, and I would say traditionalist conservative, not the modern conservative, Henry L. Stimson was the Secretary of War, a conservative of the old school, who also understood that there were important issues of war and peace, and they could not be dealt with in the haphazard way that the Truman administration was doing it. And he desperately attempted to cut short what he understood, and he and John McCloy, his deputy, understood would be an arms race of horrendous proportions, and urged Truman, he met with Truman, to meet with Stalin and to say, look, we've got this weapon, we've got to cut short, we've got to find a way to get arms control before we build up the other alternative. The Truman administration, and particularly Secretary of State, James F. Burns, who's a major figure in this. Truman himself was a novice. He'd become president unexpectedly when Roosevelt died. And the man who's really guiding him is James F. Burns, the Secretary of State. Historians know a lot about him, but most Americans don't. Burns was the guy who was a senator who took the young senator, Harry Truman, under his wing when he came into the Senate early on, and kind of became his mentor. And then when Truman became president, he made him Secretary of State, and still Burns pretty much dominated Truman in the first couple of years. After the first couple of years, Truman got tired of it and also became more confident as president. He was totally lost as president when Roosevelt died, and Burns was an old hand and was running the show in the first year and a half of the Cold War. But after a while, Truman got tired of him and let him go. But in these early period, it was Burns who was saying, drop the bomb, get tough with the Russians. We can make this work in a very hard liner. And he did, and that's what happened in the early years, where what the natural result was the Russians saw no other option, of course, there was no other option available. They built their nuclear weapons, we built our nuclear weapons, and the result is what we see for decades of the Cold War. It could have been cut short. Henry Wallace desperately urged an alternative policy. Many people in the peace movement urged an alternative policy. But the Truman administration at this point saw the, what he called a hammer on those boys, meaning the atomic bomb, meaning those boys, meaning the Russians. He saw this, with Burns' advice, as a really powerful weapon, foolishly, because they inevitably had to build their own and tighten down on Russian society as they went. So that early use of the atomic bomb is not so much about ending the Japanese war. That was pretty much going to be over when the Russians came in, because everyone knew, the intelligence knew the Russians, with the Russian entry, the Japanese could not face the US, the UK, and the Red Army, and that they were suing for peace, and US intelligence showed that. So the atomic bomb at that point is more about the start of the Cold War than it is about the end of the Second World War. And it's a tragedy, a profound tragedy, because there were other options at that point. And we went on to a long campaign of thinking that the atomic bomb gave the United States, in a misguided thought, that the atomic bomb gave the United States the capacity to dominate the US negotiations with the Soviet Union. Instead, they clamped down. The early signs were free elections in Hungary, for instance, before things got worse, 1945 and 46. There was openings of more peace in Central Europe. There might have been a different post-war era, but for the atomic bomb, and especially the way US policymakers understood the atomic bomb as the powerful weapon on their hip to dominate world politics. So the story is not a pretty story in the post-war period. And the other result is, which we're still living with, is an arms race that's continued to this day, now with nuclear weapons and long-range missile capacities, still unstable, still subject to a possible error that could cause tremendous world damage. We still live with that. We have not launched in a serious way a serious arms control disarmament regime for 20 years now. We have not seen presidents or the peace movement able to organize the demands for dealing with the instability that's inevitable with nuclear weapons. So the story of that early period is instructive, and it illuminates the failings of the national leadership at this time, the excessive hubris of believing this gave all power. And in a surprising way, it also illuminates both the left, Henry Wallace movement that's trying to stop all of this, but even some of the responsible conservatives, like those represented by Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson. He made several efforts and then left office and retired, a failure in this respect, and one of the great failures of his life. So that is kind of a short overview of what happened in the first period after the use of the atomic bombs. But from the very beginning, American policymakers in 1945 in the Truman administration saw the bomb as a weapon against the Russians, not so much against the Japanese, and demonstrating, because the war was essentially over, and we knew it because we'd broken the Japanese intelligence and were watching the intelligence that made it very clear that they were trying to somehow find a way to get out of the war, and would certainly come out of the war once the Russians entered, which they did on August 8th. So if you want to think about timing and symbolism of all this, the atomic bomb was tested on August 6th. The Japanese were begging for surrender on August 7th and 8th. Here in Nagasaki was bombed on August 9th. That's the sequence that illuminates this timing of things at that point. By the way, the invasion of Japan, if it had ever occurred, could not even begin with the first landing until November, given the logistical problems. There were 3 months left before there would be any American troops in a landing. And the real invasion would have been the spring of 1946. There was plenty of time to test whether or not the advice by the US intelligence was correct, that the war could be ended by negotiation long before there would be any men lost in an invasion. And if that didn't work, you could use the atomic bombs well before there would be any landing. So that's the short version. The long version is a unstable, ongoing danger of somebody making a mistake with thermonuclear weapons, which still is not under control and which waits to be challenged by the administration, by diplomacy, and above all by the peace movements in many, many countries around the world. Probably we could leave it at that. That's probably shortened it all too quickly, but that's the big picture of what was going on in 1945 and 46.
Well, thank you for that thumbnail summary. Those who are interested in the fuller story could go to Gar's books, Atomic Diplomacy, and his later book, The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb and the Architecture of an American Myth. Thinking beyond the immediate aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, can you, as a historian and a political economist, reflect on the longer term playing out of this expanded role that the U.S. had carved for itself in the post-war decades, actually, up to the present?
Let me also first, well, I noticed on people on the list, an old friend of mine just came on. I want to say hello to Lance Lindblom, whose name has just appeared but on the list. Hello, Lance. Good to see you. The real issue, that's two or three issues. The pre-nuclear weapons era, that is up until the July 16th, 1945 Alamogordo test, and certainly the August 6th use and the Potsdam Conference just in between those in July of 1945. The pre-atomic era discussions in the Roosevelt administration and also in the Truman administration were pretty clear. They went something like this. The real post-war threat is that there will not be another German revival, because that's where the industrial powerhouse of Europe was and still is. And therefore, the question of the peace is how to stabilize Europe. If we can do that and also stabilize Japan, then the threat of a post-war danger after World War II can be reduced radically. Now, this is pre-nuclear weapons. The answer to that, US policymakers agreed throughout the administration, was a joint American-Russian agreement to stabilize those two regions, that you couldn't do it without the Russians in Europe, and you probably couldn't do it without the Russians jointly in Japan. Moreover, they had the same interests to do the same thing, because they had suffered far more from World War II than anybody, certainly than us. The Germans might be suffered even more. And so there was a joint interest in doing that, and many American policymakers understood that that was true. So in not pursuing that option, but in using the atomic bomb as the way the United States could, in theory, control and stabilize the post-war Europe and post-war Japan, they did that, and certainly the atomic bomb did give some pressure. But on the other hand, as the conservative Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson, warned again and again and again, you might be able to stabilize Europe and Japan, but if you build the atomic bomb without working out a deal with the Russians, they will build atomic bombs, and probably after them, the Chinese will, and you'll be off to a much more dangerous arms race, which of course is what happened, because the Truman administration saw the atomic bomb not simply to stabilize the post-war war in Europe, Germany, and Japan, but also, as what Truman said, a hammer on those boys, as I said earlier, meaning the Russians, thinking that that would force the Russians to agree to US positions throughout the world. And most importantly, although this is lost to most people because it's not in everyday consciousness, but it's well defined in modern historiography, the US began pushing the Russians very hard in Eastern Europe, and Hungary, and in Poland, and in Czechoslovakia. This is before the clampdown, before the Russian clampdown. And American policymakers, some of them, like Henry L. Stimson, the conservative Secretary of War, conservative Republican, said if you push them there, what they will do is clamp down. And particularly if you build up Germany, then they will see Eastern Europe as their control zone. And that's precisely what happened. Whether or not we would have had a different regime, whether or not Eastern Europe might have looked entirely different, as many thought in the administration, if we had stabilized Germany, not made a threat, and not pushed on Eastern Europe, whether that whole world of destruction and the totalitarianism in Eastern Europe had to be, that's very much unclear. And a number of historians have argued, and I believe correctly, that if you had worked out a deal with the Russians as had been planned prior to the atomic bomb to control the German threat, then Eastern Europe might have been a very different place. Instead, what happened is we built up Germany, and as Germany was built up, Eastern Europe became tightly controlled in a very ugly way by the Soviets. And we don't know whether the other option was possible. Early signs were that it was likely. Secretary of State Marshall, formerly chairman of the Joint Chiefs, ran the Cold War but became Secretary of State. He believed in the early period that was certainly likely and tried to make that happen, but failed. So that's a long historiographical debate now amongst many historians, long lost to history. But the modern question is getting, how do we open up more stability in Europe? How do we reduce the nuclear threat? And which still is a threat in a very different way. These things are unstable. Some mistake can be made. Not surprisingly, other countries have been trying to get nuclear weapons. I think there are 9 now that have significant capacity. And it doesn't take much imagination over time to imagine mistakes being made and the dangers that were foreseen from Oppenheimer and others and many others and conservatives like Stimson, that the dangers are still with us. We've been very lucky worldwide that one of these things hasn't gone off, or that somebody hasn't made a mistake. And the question is how long our luck lasts, and whether or not there can be a new anti-nuclear movement to try to control and stabilize. There has not been much work. Let me now address not the history, but folks like perhaps some of the folks listening and work on this discussion. We have not been able to mount a serious anti-nuclear movement. It has been modest. There has not been a serious effort to control these weapons pushed by public opinion. And more or less, we're depending upon the good luck of the people like the last administration or the current administration, or maybe the next administration that will manage these things. And in my view, that's having worked at higher levels of the U.S. government for my sins at an earlier period in my life, and being a historian of this period, I don't think that we're going to get anywhere without a movement that begins to say it's time to change all of this as we go forward. So that's the lesson, at least I take from this history.
Well, let me open the floor to questions that others might have. And for those who are viewing this on YouTube, you don't have any way of getting correct questions to us directly, but you can send them by email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And I will pass them on to those who are here with us in the Zoom room. Those who are in the Zoom room, of course, can put your question directly. And so let me ask if there is anyone who would like to raise a question or make a comment on what's been said so far. There's a lot more we have to go over, but let's have a bit of discussion of what we've covered up to this point. So if you have a question, want to make a comment, I will put you all on gallery view so I can see everybody. Just turn on your camera and wave at me, and I'll call on you. Perhaps Lance wants to say hello and maybe say something beyond that. If you want to to turn your camera on and unmute yourself. While we're waiting for that, I see Susan Newberger has turned her camera on. Hi. Did you want to speak? Unmute yourself. There you
There
go.
we go. No, I just had figured out how to turn the camera on, so I showed up. But Cliff, I was in the discussion yesterday, and it was so good to see you. So that's really all I have to say. I guess you're in San Miguel, though.
Yes, we're in San Miguel. Susan is one of those, I was telling Gar before we started that there are many who come to San Miguel during the winter months. Susan was one of those, but COVID is keeping most people away. That's why we're doing these webinars. We don't have our live audiences that we used to.
And I was fortunate enough to go to Cuba with Cliff.
Yes. That's another thing that the center does. We've been sending, well, for 30 years, we've been sending educational trips to Cuba. So let me pose another question to Gar that occurred to me as you were talking about the history and what might have been historically. Going back a little earlier, what if Norman Wallace had been president or vice president instead of Truman and became president after Roosevelt died? That's an issue that Oliver Stone and Peter Kuznick have addressed. How Wallace was the convention that nominated Truman was prepared to nominate Wallace as vice president, but was maneuvered away from it. Do you have any comments about that historical might have?
Well, certainly were signs that the Truman administration in the early years in its foreign policy was run by Truman, but more important by a man named James Burns, his Secretary of State. Truman was a novice. He knew almost nothing about foreign policy. And he appointed Burns, who had been his guide in the Senate. Who had taken him under his wing when Truman was a freshman senator. And when he made Burns the Secretary of State, Burns dominated the policy for the first 2 years of the Truman administration, not quite 2 years of the Truman administration. So the policy you see in the early Truman administration is really James F. Burns. And he's the man behind the policies we were talking about, hardline policies. Wallace had a very different view. Wallace believed that there was with Roosevelt, who also had a very different view, that the Russians had security interests in Eastern Europe because of the 2 invasions in one lifetime by Germany into Russia. But that they could be, if you could deal with German power, control it militarily, they might ease up on Eastern Europe, which they did in the early months, free elections in Hungary, for instance. Later on, they clamped down as we built up Germany. They clamped down on Eastern Europe. But there had Wallace become president, had he stayed as vice president and become president when Roosevelt died, there are at least reasons to believe a very different kind of policy might have maintained than the one that Truman followed under Burns's advice and under Truman's own personal impulses, which were very narrow in his conception of how to act. His view when the atomic bomb was tested, I think as I mentioned, I may not have mentioned, He was at the Potsdam meeting in 1945, July, with Stalin, and got news that the test had worked. It was just a theory until July 16th. And he said, now I've got a hammer on those boys. And the alternative view was this is the time to really, Henry L. Stimson, the Secretary of War, conservative Republican, no, this is the time to prevent an arms race. We surely will try to build this up if we try to use this as a diplomatic weapon, and we'll be off to the races, which is, of course, what happened. We're still living with the result of that. It might have been cut short early on by a different to somehow stabilize the world situation at an early point. And on and on into 1946, when the US policy was still to drive ahead for more weapons, and the Russians followed suit. There were no serious negotiations. There were negotiations, but there was no serious hope from the US side. And we just kept building on, testing weapons in Bikini during the middle of the discussions and so forth. So that's a tragedy. A genuine tragedy, because there might well have been a different world order had something different taken place. Had Roosevelt lived, there might have been different policies. Had there been a different Secretary of State, et cetera, et cetera. One of the great scholars of this period, William Appleman Williams, wrote a book called "The Tragedy of American Diplomacy," a genuine tragedy, not simply a easily dismissed historical phenomenon.
And so we have the world that we have. But it's interesting to reflect how it could have been a very different world. It makes a difference who is in the right place at the right time, or who is the wrong person in the position of power at a given moment in history. That can do so much to shape the future for generations.
In this case, definitely. Not always, but in this case, I think that's true.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Lance,
First
please.
of all, I apologize. I had to switch devices, so that's why I couldn't respond before. So, but I'm now on my iPad. First of all, it's really good to see you, Gar.
Yep, same here, Lance. Good seeing you.
Too long. Basically, there's been a whole new set of histories coming out about this period and the pre-war period. You have Jonathan Haslam's book, The Specter of War, which sort of puts a whole new take on the appeasement thing as really an anti-communist effort to direct Germany to attack Russia rather than to go west. And you have the new histories of like Stalin's War by Sheen McKinnon. I was just wondering if you've looked at that new literature and what you think of it.
The truth, Lance, I have not been keeping up as much as I should. I've been doing mostly economic reconstruction work these days, but I read the reviews. As a friend of mine says, I haven't been reading those books personally. I've been trying to keep up on it, but I think that literature is very important because it's opening that direction. You might want to say a bit more about it if you've been reading that for the folks.
I mean, part of it, and I've been sort of trying to keep up with that literature. It's great being retired. And as a response to the pandemic. But anyway, there seems to be much more complicated pictures being drawn about what was going on both before, during, and after World War II. And what were the powers and the various factions at work. In fact, there's been a lot of really interesting work on World War I too that's also come out that makes it more of a kind of internal factional issues within societies rather than between countries. But I mean, given those kinds of issues, given all the issues that we confronted over the years, Gar, about the arms race, I mean, what gives you any optimism? And I don't mean this as coming from some sort of cantankerous older man now, but I mean, where do you see the possible interventions that we can deal with these issues?
You know, I'm not a perpetual optimist on this subject, but I do think that that the whole climate issue opens the door, because if there were an exchange of nuclear weapons, we would be facing something like nuclear winter, which is, basically enough fallout in the atmosphere to block a lot of sunlight, and the terrible results that would have environmentally and in terms of food production. So I keep looking for, and speaking out whenever I can, for the new generation to pick up on this in a new way. One of the things that has happened is there hasn't been a major nuclear scare for a while. I hope we don't get a scare that leads beyond a scare. But hope blooms eternal, that we can begin to build a larger movement that will begin to recognize this again. I have no magic solutions, except history's going to show us occasionally you get a breakthrough, and we got to keep working at it.
Well, do you think that the prospect of an increase in the U.S. nuclear arsenal and a modernization of that arsenal could provide a point of entry for some public challenge?
It's yes, the answer is it, but the word could needs to be underscored. If you look at the rise of movements, they usually have a larger triggering event, but not always. That is to say, some big event that is very dangerous and gets people wide awake. But we may see some of those, and we may see a whole new anti-nuclear movement. I'm not a perpetual optimist, but also not a perpetual pessimist. The work of folks like us is just keep talking as best we can about what's happening, and along with a lot of other people, we may get to the breakthrough point. Let me say something more about that. The prehistory of important movements. The prehistory. If you look at the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the really interesting work was done in the 30s and 40s and 50s by people you don't know the names of, but you may know a few of the names, but keeping at it to laying the groundwork. And then at a certain point, there was a possibility of a breakthrough. My heroes are those people who were not well known, some of them were, but very few of them were well known, who were trying and did not give up during the difficult moments, and carried the ball and carried the torch. And at some point there was a breakthrough. So I see history as always having that possibility, though not an inevitability, and it keeps me thinking that efforts like this particular effort these are important things to do. Keep the light alive.
Are there other questions or comments?
Well, do you see any hope with the various cast of characters in the Biden administration to once again start really looking at these particular issues?
I have not seen anybody taking serious initiatives, but that doesn't mean that something isn't going on behind the scenes, that they're preparing something quietly that we don't know about or going. But I have not seen any signs of it. Have you, Lance? You maybe followed it.
No, that's why I was curious. In fact, it's almost, except for the SALT talks, the treaty issues, which just seems to be a continuation. At least there was an extension. But come on, help me. I'm looking at all corners for hope here, Gar.
Hope lies at these moments in as many of us as we can keep the ball bouncing, and the younger folks picking up that ball. And unfortunately, the danger of some misstep or some explosion of the, all the bad thing that can get people going again too. My heroes are let me put it this way. My heroes are the civil rights movement in the 1920s. Those are people you don't know about who are keeping it alive, and by the time it explodes really in the 60s. That's the task of people in this era, I think. like this, like these kinds of meetings we're having right now.
Let me switch the focus a bit, if I may. In our opening, I referred to the New Yorker article, just republished now in the New York Times, I understand, that in which Gar was outed as one of those that assisted Daniel Ellsberg in the dissemination of the Pentagon Papers. He was a key figure in the, what is it called, that Lavender Hill gang?
Yes.
That that got copies around to various newspapers, the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, etc., and thereby got around the efforts of the Nixon White House to prevent the Pentagon Papers from becoming public knowledge. That of course was clandestine when you did it, and it's only just a few years ago that you went public on your role in that. Many of your co-conspirators, if I may say that, were all of you were quite legally vulnerable. Many of them remain anonymous. Would you want to talk a little bit about that episode? Gar has been, he referred a moment ago to the heroic actions that are needed to make change. And certainly this was an example of such heroic action. Tell us about it, Gar.
I don't know if it's heroic, but I can tell you about it. And is it reprinted in the New Yorker now? Is it just out online again? Yeah. You know, the moral of this story is that things can happen in unexpected ways, and then you get to say yes or no. History attacks you right straight on and says yes or no. I did not know Daniel Ellsberg. I never met him. Know nothing about the Pentagon Papers. A mutual friend invited the two of us to dinner. So the small dinner of, I think, 6 people. And I met him, and he was at MIT, and I had been at the Institute of Politics at Harvard. And so I met him, and we had a nice chat. We didn't talk about the Pentagon Papers, and we talked about arms control, nuclear weapons. He's an expert. Dan is an expert on nuclear arms control issues. He worked in the RAND Corporation. And so we had a lot in common to talk about that. And then as we left dinner, I walked out with one of the other guests, and the woman, and she said, could you help us? I said, what is that about? And she revealed that they had the Pentagon Papers in her closet, and they wanted to disseminate them, and they could use some help. Would I help? And that's how history happened for me. And so then history stares you in the face and say, you have to say yes or no. So I was a young, anti-war activist, and I said yes. So Dan went underground after the first release of papers, and I became the architect of how to distribute. And I had been, I'd worked in the House and Senate, and so I knew something about the press corps in Washington. And so Dan's impulse was to, get these things out. It's desperately important to get them out. Well, there are thousands of pages. You get one news story in the New York Times if you dump them all, and that's it. So I, twisted his arm behind his back, and I said, no, we'll do this sequentially. We'll drop a piece now, and New York Times will do a story, then give us 2 more days, and Washington Post will do a story in the next chunk. And we can probably keep this going for 3 weeks if we're good at it, which is what we did. Dan hid out underground. And I hadn't known him before. I'd never met Dan except for the dinner party. And we arranged, Walter Cronkite did an interview with him, flew up to Cambridge and did it in some friend of ours' wonderful living room. And they're wonderful graduate students who would, wonderful stories like the following that one graduate student told me. I think it may have been the Washington Post reporter who wanted a chunk of the Pentagon Papers, thousands of pages. And so she met him at the Washington airport, and at a certain place, just sit there. And then so he sat there at a certain place in the airport, and then she walked up and sat next to him and put a box on the next chair and said, "I have to leave now, but you could have that box." And things like that happened. And there were a group of graduate students who were distributing the papers one by one, rather than all at one newspaper. So we kept the story alive on and off for about 3 weeks. And I was sort of the guy Dan was hiding out in my secretary's apartment, and I was kind of managing the graduate students. And I had some press experience in working in the Senate. So I was kind of the maestro, I guess. But I wasn't doing it. I was just sort of guiding it. I guess I was doing it.
So Dan was eventually arrested, and you were there when that arrest took place, correct?
Mhm. Yep. Well, he surrendered in Boston, in one of the major squares, but there were thousands of people surrounding him, supporters, and he voluntarily surrendered. That's been captured in the videos. He thought he was going to jail for life, and he thought that when he made the Pentagon Papers public, he believed that he would be in prison the rest of his life. He's a genuine hero in that respect. It didn't happen because of the way the government handled their case and broke into his apartment, and so that didn't happen. But that was unexpected that it didn't happen. People like me, I didn't think I was going to get caught.
And it wasn't until a few years later that you did go public. And why did you then finally?
I can't recall the exact sequence of how and why. I'm blocking on it right now, but I did go public at a certain point, and I think it was trying to encourage others to go public during one of our ongoing war scares.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the thing that strikes me to say about it is, I was not planning to do any of this. History hits you in the face and you say yes or no. I'm walking out of dinner with this guy named Dan Ellsberg, who I'd never met. And this woman says to me, "We have these papers, would you help us? Yes or no?" I said, yes. I said, okay. So the woman was kind of an interesting woman. That's a whole nother story.
Well, it's another case of having the right person in the right place at the right moment.
Yeah, lots of chance encounters.
Mm-hmm.
Are you still teaching, Gar?
No, we're running the institute, which in one way or another you helped launch long ago, Lance. But it's we do some teaching, but we do a lot of research, mainly on economic reconstruction, community reconstruction, public enterprise, regional enterprise. It's called the Democracy Collaborative,
right.
And that's still going. So we do some seminar teaching and a lot of webinar teaching, and we're connecting up with a couple of universities that are doing more courses on this now, and spreading the word. And that's a big push now. And a guy named Gus Speth, James Gustav Speth, a well-known, who's my co-director of some part of the studies program, has published a collection of essays on the next system, New Systems Reader, it's called, by Gustav Speth. And we're trying to say, how do we look beyond the current models of capitalism and socialism? And on the other hand, a lot of energy on examples on the ground of worker-owned companies, community-owned companies, public enterprise, trying to illuminate all the practical work that's going on. So we do a lot of that as well. But I'm not teaching except through the seminars and webinars. And I'm no longer at the university.
And I might mention one of Gar's recent books is Principles of a Pluralist Commonwealth, that puts forth the philosophic basis for the kind of community development work that he's currently doing.
That's available free online if you go to my webpage as well, or the Democracy Collaborative webpage.
I was just wondering what kind of insights you're getting and you're feeling from the students that you are working with, especially the graduate students and the researchers that are working, that are younger.
Oh, there's a lot of interest in this going on around the country. It hasn't got much publicity, but there's a lot of cooperatives and worker-owned companies and land trusts, neighborhood-owned land, and public utility discussion. And if you go to the website, the Democracy Collaborative, or the Next System Project is the website, WWW. There's tons of experimentation that isn't covered by the press. And then there's a lot of theoretical work. This book that Gus published has got some of the theory and seminars and ongoing things. It's a movement that I suspect will open into a much more broader public discussion because there's a huge amount of interest at the state and local level around the country, and lots of wonderful activism. So, but those are the websites: the Next System Project and the Democracy Collaborative websites will give folks who are watching this an opportunity to see that. You had something to do with launching all this, Lance, so I take my hat off to you. Lance and I go back a long way.
Caused a lot of trouble, but
I hope so.
And you know, I think,
trouble.
and I think it's important to recognize the role that such institutions can play. It's one thing to have a social movement, to have a campaign, to launch petitions, etc. But to create an institution that does the hard groundwork for developing an issue and bringing it to public attention, like the Democracy Collaborative. That's important. That's an important part of the organizing work that is often overlooked.
What was the second organization he mentioned after Democracy Collaborative or GAR?
The Democracy Collaborative, preceding that was something called the Cambridge Institute, the Center for and then the Center for Economic Alternatives. Was there another one that I mentioned that somebody catch me
New
on?
Systems, something?
Oh, the Next System Project,
Oh,
which is
okay.
a project of the Democracy Collaborative. If you go to the Democracy Collaborative webpage, www.democracycollaborative.org, there you'll find the Next System Project, which is a big project that we have, a semi-autonomous project that we launched. And part of it is theoretical, lots and lots of, if you don't like the way capitalism has developed and you don't like the way state socialism has developed, what do you want for the future? That's a genuine intellectual as well as political problem. And we've published lots, we've had a huge ongoing academic debate and activist debate about systems design. And the book I mentioned by Gus Speth brings together some of that, but if you go online to the Democracy Collaborative, you'll find all these essays available free to the public on that, and conferences and meetings on how do we look beyond current models of capitalism, socialism. And on the other hand, what projects in the here and now, worker-owned companies, neighborhood-owned industries, public industries, proposals for regional ownership like the Tennessee Valley Authority, what models in the here and now point in a new direction? There's a lot of worker co-ops, for instance. There's a lot of neighborhood ownership going on, most of it not covered by the press. And we try to report on what we can find on practical developments here and abroad. Some of them very exciting and interesting, like there's a big one in Cleveland that's quite large, which harnesses the purchasing power of hospitals and universities. They have a lot of public dollars in them to buy from worker and community-owned industries and build up a much larger complex. And that's one there, and it's a big one. We've had something to do with in Preston, England, where there's a big model demonstration project of new directions. So it's both theory, but also practical experiments that point in the new direction. If you look at the New Deal program in the 1930s, basically it was a recapitulation of experiments at the state and local grassroots level. and expansion of those. So I take these experiments very seriously as laying groundwork for policies beyond. And we try to cover the practical as well as the theoretical. And I do want to take my hats off to Lance, who used to run a wonderful foundation, and he gave rise to a lot of this long ago. He may not want to take credit for it, but he should.
I was on the easy side of it.
No, he wasn't. There weren't many people willing to take those risks, Lance.
Well, we've covered three very interesting aspects of Gar's work. We can see that he's had a long and fruitful history.
That's another way of saying he's getting old.
Not all of us, though, have had such a fruitful career as we've moved through life.
You're kind. You're kind.
Right. Well, without any further questions, I guess we should wrap this up. I want to give warm thanks to Gar Alperovitz for sharing his experiences and his thinking and his research with us today. It's been a very informative discussion, and I want to thank all of those who have participated, have viewed it, and will be viewing it, because many view it later on YouTube. I should point out that all of our webinars are available on YouTube, accessible through globaljusticecenter.org. But before we close it off, I see Dick Snyder has his hands up. Go ahead, Dick.
Yeah, Gar, I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about what you've seen in the future. You know, today we got a horrendous report about global warming that came out, how that relates to the potential of nuclear conflict. You know, that whole dimension about what's going to be happening as the world becomes more and more chaotic.
I'm not much of a futurologist, but I do think there are lots of signs of nothing will change unless two things happen within countries. That is, a policy gets pretty wedged. And I used to, for my sins, I was a policymaker in a fairly high level at one point. But unless you change the groundwork, and I worked in the House and Senate as well, unless there's buildup from the bottom, and there is a lot of buildup from the bottom going on. But I think we're looking at both restraining from within countries, restraining the natural impulse of leadership and the established organizations that are dominating policy from the bottom up, whether corporate or military usually. Restraint, but also really taking seriously not only the building of political movements, and there are some very wonderful young progressive political movements, but understanding that systems don't change unless you alter the institutional base of the systems. So I personally take seriously a walk on two legs policy. Do whatever you can in politics now, but lay groundwork both in ideas and in practical experiments for changing the structure of the political economic system. I take my guide from the feminist movement, which understood you want to play this, and the civil rights movement in the early days. You want to play this game? Don't bother unless you're willing to put 20 or 30 years on the table. Those are the chips you play this game with. So you got to do what you can now, but understand there's really important work laying groundwork for longer term change. In that sense, as a historian, I'm not deeply pessimistic. I think things can build up. The civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the environmental movement, the labor movement, those took that kind of time span to get anywhere. And I think a systemic change, redevelopment, reconstruction is in the same category.
Well, we have COP26, the climate conference coming up in November, and today the big news is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issuing its very disturbing report, which is what Dick was referring to, that says that the climate change that we've been experiencing is basically locked in. Not much we can do about that. The most we can do is hopefully help prevent it from getting worse. So there's definitely a challenge there for us, and it's something that that many, particularly the younger generation, is very concerned about, because it is their future that is being their hope for a livable future that is being undermined by climate change. So we've seen Greta Thunberg and others who, let's see, Greta Thunberg sort of rose to fame, what was it, about 3 years ago with the school strikes. And we had here in San Miguel a large demonstration of support, our own strike action on climate change. And hopefully others will become involved in that as well. So it's often issues like that where there's a sense of urgency that mobilize people, that move them into action. Leading up to COP26, the Center for Global Justice will be doing a couple webinars on climate change. So look for those in our schedule in coming months. Okay, well, I think we probably should wrap it up with that. And again, I want to give Gar a great thanks for sharing this time with us today, as well as yesterday when he spoke to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. That talk will also be available on YouTube for those who missed it. But let me just call your attention to next week's webinar, which will be on a successful eco resort cooperative here in Mexico called Tolantongo. We will be featuring a film produced by a member of our board, Atahualpa Caldera Sosa. And hopefully he'll be present to discuss it as well. But it's an example that Gar, of the kind of thing that Gar is referring to, the formation of cooperatives as ways of developing and empowering a community. And we have a very successful one here to look at in Mexico. So let me close by giving a thanks to our webinar team, Roberto Robles, Liz Mestras, Gregory Diamant, Olivia Canales, and myself. And now this is Cliff Durand signing off until next Monday.
Great to see you, Gar.
Great seeing you.